This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Well, what is philosophy concerned with? We know what philosophy is, or we have an elementary idea of that. We also have some notion of what the task of the philosopher is, and that everyone is pursuing that task, whether they're doing it well or not. But it might be good for us now to say, what do philosophers concern themselves with? And I'm going to give you a broad answer, and then I'm going to specialize, try to break it down a little bit for you. I think it can be said truly that philosophy is concerned with presuppositions and the conceptual muddles that we find in or area of concern. Philosophy is concerned with the presuppositions and the conceptual muddles that we find in any field of endeavor or area of concern. The philosopher is interested in systematically basic questions that come up in any field of study. Psychologists study, of course, the human soul and human personality, but then there are certain presuppositions that are used by psychologists that philosophers are interested in studying. Moreover, in the field of psychology, certain conceptual muddles arise. Let's say about human nature. Are human beings animals? Are they free? Are they determined? And philosophy is interested in those kinds of things. So a philosopher is concerned with the presuppositions and the conceptual problems, the muddles that come up in any field of endeavor or any area of concern. Now, more specifically, there are 3 or 4 standard areas of philosophical specialization. And you need to know a little bit about this before I launch into the real subject of my second lecture tonight. Philosophy deals with a number of things, but if we were to simplify it and put them in categories, we'd say the philosopher is interested in metaphysics, in epistemology, in ethics, and then one more I want to add, and that's logic. And you're probably saying, well, that's real helpful, Dr. Bahnsen. What is metaphysics? What is epistemology? What is ethics? You probably have some idea what that is. What is logic? So let me try to define those terms for you. I'll give a little advertisement here. If you would be interested in getting a sheet, philosophical vocabulary, that tells you some of the basic terms that are used by philosophers and what they mean, that will kind of help you, I think, conceptually, to organize your thinking, be familiar with the field. You can write to Covenant Tape Ministry, one of the subsidiary ministries of the Study Center that supplies my materials, and they will be glad to get that to you. You can, for some modest price, pick that up. First of all, metaphysics is the study of the nature, structure, and origin of what exists. Metaphysics is just the fancy term that we use for the study of reality, what exists. In particular, the nature of reality. What do you mean, the nature of reality? Is reality physical or spiritual? Is it substantial or in process? The nature of reality, the structure of reality, and the origin of reality, or what exists. Metaphysics studies cosmological questions like the or different theories of the universe and where it came from. Metaphysics is the study of the nature, structure, and origin of what exists. I tell you something funny here, funny to me, maybe not to you. When you go into a bookstore, and it has a special section called metaphysical writing, you would say, well, this doesn't look real philosophical to me. It looks kind of occult and weird and kind of Twilight Zone stuff. It is. In a certain sense, that's an abuse of the term metaphysics, but in another sense, that fits. Metaphysics studies that which goes beyond the physical world of our experience. What is the nature of reality? Are there spiritual beings? What is the force of life and things like that? When you get those metaphysical writings in the bookstore, that's just kind of bizarre metaphysics. I think that's what they ought to say. Bizarre metaphysics. Metaphysics does a lot of very intellectual, philosophical study about questions as well. Now then, epistemology. Epistemology is another subdivision of philosophical study, the one in which I have been very interested. I did my doctoral work in this area. It's crucial to the defense of the faith because epistemology is the study of the nature and limits of human knowledge. Epistemology has to do with how we know what we know, the nature of knowledge and the limits of knowledge, human knowledge. A metaphysician will ask questions like, what does it mean to know something? And I would tell you, if I know something, that means I believe it, it's true, and I have good reason for it. If you lack any of those components, you don't say that I know it. If I believe something and have a good reason for it, but it doesn't happen to be true, I can't know it, because you can't know things that are false. On the other hand, I may have a belief that happens to be true, but I don't have any good reason for it, which is totally arbitrary. We wouldn't say, well, you knew it. You just say that was a lucky guess or something like that. Metaphysics studies questions like that. What is the nature of knowledge? And what are the sources of knowledge? How do we know what we know? How can we justify our beliefs? Can we justify our beliefs based on human testimony, eyewitness accounts? Is memory reliable? Those are epistemological questions. Ethics. Well, we all have some idea of what ethics is because I think that's the term up on the board that we use probably more readily than the others. Ethics is the study of right and wrong actions and attitudes, put it very simply. Ethics is the study of right and wrong actions and attitudes. How should we act? What attitudes should we have? Which are the right ones? Which are the wrong ones? And of course, ethics is very interesting because it pertains to our behavior. Should we go to war? How should I treat my neighbor? What should we say about sexual controversies like homosexuality or what have you? Ethics studies right and wrong actions and attitudes, but the philosopher more these days is concerned with how we do ethics and what is the meaning of fundamental ethical terms like right or wrong. What does it mean to say that something is right, to say that something is wrong? There are different schools of ethics. So utilitarianism is one that you might be familiar with. The utilitarian says something is right if it is in the best interest for bringing happiness to the greatest number of people. And so if this promises to make more people happy, if it's the utilitarian thing to do, then it's right. Others would say that when we say that something is right, we're not talking about anything like that, like a calculus of making people happy or the most people happy. So those are philosophical questions having to do with the foundations of ethics, often called meta-ethics in our day. And then finally on the board you see a fourth philosophical specialization that we call logic. Some of you may have had a course in logic. I think everyone should have a course in logic. And by the way, if you'd like that, we hope to provide that through our study center. But one way or another, logic is the study of the principles for distinguishing correct reasoning from incorrect reasoning. A logician looks at reasoning patterns that people may have and looks at them in terms of whether they lead to truth, whether they are valid, whether they are correct ways of reasoning or incorrect, reliable or unreliable ways of reasoning. For instance, here's an argument. You should all sign up for a course in my study center or I'll punch you in the nose. Okay? That is what we call an appeal to force or violence. And does the oughtness of your taking a course in the study center receive any support from the threat in the nose? The logician says, no, that doesn't really support your premise, and therefore that is a fallacious way of reasoning. Or if I say, you all should vote for Steve Martin for president because he's a wild and crazy guy. And so many people like him that we'd all be happy if he was the elected president. Now, there are actually a whole bunch of arguments that I've given there if you were to trace them out. But the argument that says vote for this guy because he's most popular is also a fallacious way of reasoning, because truth doesn't always go with the majority. I know there's some people who don't like to hear that, but the fact of the matter is the majority is sometimes wrong. So logic studies such matters like that, as well as arguments that are translated into symbolic form. That is to say, lesson fun. If you take a sentence or a premise, any one of your, call it P, and take another one that we call Q, then we can ask how these are related to each other in terms of terms, in terms of the vocabulary of if, then, and, or, and not, which are called logical particles. And so we put things together like this. If P, then Q. That is to say, if this premise is true, then it follows that this premise is true. Now then, I assert secondly that P is true. The first premise on the board is not P. The first premise on the board is if P, then Q. You have to hold them together in that if-then relationship. The second premise, however, is just the assertion of P. And the logician will tell us that Q follows. Use if P, then Q. I assert P, therefore Q follows. Logician also points out that there are certain forms of argument that are wrong, that are fallacious or misleading. Let's see if we can get a misleading form of argument. Thank you. Well, the one I want, though, doesn't go like that. If we affirm the consequent, that is to say, that which is the following, the trailing premise from an if-then remark, and then say on the basis of that, the antecedent is true. That is, if P then Q, Q, therefore P, there are often cases where that looks like that'd be a good form of reasoning, but then there are others that it's very obvious that it is not. And so this is considered a fallacy. It's called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. I'd like to give you an example. Let's take as P, Shakespeare wrote Paradise Lost. We'll take as Q, Shakespeare is a great author. Okay, have I thoroughly confused you? P is going to be Shakespeare wrote Paradise Lost. Q is Shakespeare is a great author. Okay, now, if P then Q, is that true? If Shakespeare wrote Paradise Lost, is he a great author? Yeah, he wrote a great author. So if Shakespeare wrote it, then he is a great author. So we know that premise 1 is true. Now let's take premise 2. Q says Shakespeare is a great author. Is that true? Sure. I mean, most people would say it's true. Shakespeare is a great author. And so I conclude Shakespeare must have written Paradise Lost. You see how that's fallacious in this case? Logic is the study of such patterns of reasoning, trying to distinguish correct from incorrect ones. You got to erase this stuff soon, Steve. It's embedded. Sorry about the mess. Now what I'd like to do with that kind of filling out our introduction to what philosophy does is talk about some of the basic issues in philosophy throughout the history of Western culture. We'll stop along the way, kind of like tourists, just to pick up something in particular and look at it a little more closely. I'm going to be introducing you to some of the standard issues or questions that separate people when they do philosophy, and therefore some of the basic things that we as Christians need to be able to resolve and think through ourselves. I think it can be said that in the history of philosophy, in the area of metaphysics, what is metaphysics now that is not up on the board, class? Study of what? Reality, the origin, structure, nature of whatever exists. One of the basic tendencies in metaphysical study in the history of philosophy has been toward what we'll call monism. The other basic tendency in the history of philosophy in the area are toward the direction of what we'll call atomism. I'm not talking about those who are purely monist and purely atomist here. I'm talking about those whose philosophy either is that or moves in that direction over against the other one. These are tendencies in the way people think about the nature of reality. The atomist tends to approach reality as though it were made up of a number of entities that can be divided and divided and divided into smaller things. That is to say, the atomist wants to stress sharp differences in kind between things so that the stuff of a number of encapsulated entities, things that are separate from one another and discontinuous from each other. That is, it's made up of bits and pieces. It's made up of a lot of things that are different from each other. The atomistic direction of philosophy, therefore, would be illustrated in any philosophy that tends to see the world made up of atoms, smaller and smaller, pieces of reality, which are discrete or different from each other. The monist orientation in philosophy doesn't want to see the little bits of concrete reality out there separated from each other, but looks more for the uniting elements of reality, the continuity between things, so that whatever differences we find in the world are differences of degree only. Everything in the world is united and continuous with everything else in the world. Everything is mon, it's one. Okay? So, when you study the question of reality, what is the nature of reality, you're going to move toward saying everything is related to everything else, everything is one. Maybe it's of the same kind, maybe everything just is what everything else is. Or you're going to move in the direction of saying things are different from one another and all the concrete entities in this world break down into smaller and smaller, if you will, fundamental units of reality, atoms of reality. The monist, therefore, is going to focus on those aspects of reality that are enduring. The monist looks for stability, continuity, endurance. The atomist, or if you will, the static aspect of human experience. The atomist, on the other hand, looks at the dynamic aspects of reality, focusing on those which are changing, which are not enduring. Now, if we look at the history of philosophy, we look back at ancient philosophy, we find philosophers like Plato and Parmenides who thought that ultimately change in this world, change that is part of human experience, is really illusory. Change is not real. Ultimately, change needs to be explained. Why does it appear that there are things that are changing or moving in this world? You look at other philosophers who emphasize the atomistic aspect of reality, and they say change is to be taken for granted. Heraclitus, for instance, said everything is changing. You can't step in the same river twice because the river's always changing. So it's not the same river once you get your foot up and back in, no matter how fast you are. For Heraclitus, the mystery that calls for it's not change, that's taken for granted. What needs to be accounted for are the enduring elements of reality, those things that seem to be static or unchanging. Are they in motion or aren't they in motion? So in the history of philosophy, we have people that are looking at human experience of reality, and some say the stable aspects of reality are taken for granted, and we have to account for motion and change. Others say, no, motion is what you take for granted. Then you have to explain those aspects of reality that seem stable and enduring. Now, along with these different approaches to reality, you see different approaches to the theory of knowledge as well. Those who tend to see reality as united and unchanging, that's the most important thing about reality, often hold to what's called a coherence theory of truth. Those who see reality as broken up into bits and pieces and in constant change tend to hold to what's called a correspondence theory of truth. The coherence theory of truth says that a sentence is true when it's part of an overall theory that is coherent. A sentence is true if it is a member of a set, a theory, where all the other sentences cohere with each other. That is, there's consistency between them. If you can get consistency in all of the sentences that describe your experience or reality, then you're arriving at truth. On the other hand, the person holding to the correspondence theory of truth would say that truth is found not by having sentences that are consistent with each other, but by holding to a sentence that corresponds to my experience of the world. It corresponds to how I see, how I hear, how I smell or touch, whatever the world. In the correspondence theory of truth that we were just talking about, that most people following an atomistic view of reality hold, in the correspondence theory of truth, the problem is, how is it that minds that are separate from what they know, remember, we're atomistic here, everything's broken up into pieces. How is it that minds which are separate from the world that the mind knows are corresponding to each other? How is it that minds correspond to each other, and how is it that minds correspond with the objects that independently exist outside the mind? How can you be sure that your mind is in touch with what is really out there? How do you know that there is this correspondence? In the coherence theory of truth, on the other side here of our board, it says a theory is true if it's consistent, if it coheres, all the sentences cohere with each other. Minds and objects are already in a relationship because their view of reality is more monistic. And so my mind is just part of the fundamental oneness of reality that is one with the things that are known by the mind. And so now the problem becomes not how does my mind get in touch with what is out there independent of the mind, but now the problem becomes the existence of finite minds and finite truths. If everything coheres and all is one, then how can you say that my mind is separate from your mind? How can my mind be independent? How can it be finite rather than infinite? Wouldn't I have to know everything in order to know anything then? If you hold to a coherence theory of truth, you have to have a theory broad enough that everything's taken into account before you can be sure that it's coherent. Getting interesting, eh? I know that it's abstract, but I warned you that it would be abstract, so no one has the right to fall asleep just because we're being abstract tonight. The atomist approach to reality with its correspondence theory of truth says that thinking occurs in minds and is discretely related to other things like perception, imagination, volition, or what have you. Everything's discrete. Everything is broken down, separated, atomistic. Thinking takes place in the mind. The mind is related somehow to the volition. The volition and the mind are somehow related to the objects of the world. And all of these relationships become a problem. On the other hand, someone holding to a monistic approach to reality who says that coherence is the hallmark of truth and knowledge, for that person, thinking doesn't take place in the mind. Thinking just is the mind. Thinking is the mind, and the mind is an unfolding reality in which ever more completely differentiated activities arise from our attempt to understand relationships but do not arise from the nature of things. That is to say, my mind is in continuity with my will and my volition, my perceptions, my imagination, so forth, all run together, and all of those things are part of the basic reality that I know as well. So thinking is mind, rather than thinking takes place in the mind. Two different options there, depending on what kind of basic philosophy you are following. Well, this applies to a lot of different areas of philosophy. You have different views of logic. You have different views of human knowing. You have different views of political science based on what kind of philosophy you approach or use here, atomistic or monistic. Let me try to illustrate that for you. If you take the atomistic approach to reality with its correspondence theory of truth, you will look upon logic in such a way that you think there are two distinct categories of sentences. There are consistent sentences and inconsistent sentences, or if you will, consistent arguments and inconsistent arguments. And every statement should be very neatly pigeonholed into one of these logical categories, consistent or inconsistent. And when you don't know which one it fits into, then all intellectual activity halts until we can finally get that worked out. We need clarity. We need to work out the discrete categories for these sentences. On the other hand, a person who takes the coherence approach, the monistic approach to life, will say, no, those categories, they may be helpful as rough and ready indication of how to classify things, but they aren't definitive. They're only provisional. They're only tentative. And between those two categories, between the category of truth and consistency, falsity and inconsistency, there are any number of options. There's kind of a dynamic tension between them. And whenever we have a sentence that's difficult to categorize, we can't tell whether it's really true or false, that probably signalizes progress because we're getting closer to the basic monistic reality underlying. You can't really categorize that. And so this is a step forward. Progress doesn't come by sorting out our assertions into the true and false, the consistent and inconsistent. But progress comes in advancing from one unstable state of thinking to another unstable state of thinking, because we have grasped more of the reality that is so complex that it can't be pigeonholed. Yeah. You don't like that kind of thing, do you? Because basically what you're told here is no one can know for sure, and it's a sign of progress to realize that. It's a sign of progress when you see that none of our human statements can really get at the heart of reality and what truth is. And it's best for us to acknowledge. The human mind is at best going to come up with an approximation of the truth. This is what a person taking the monistic coherence approach is going to say. On the other hand, a person taking the atomistic correspondence approach to truth is going to say the human mind can arrive at discrete truths, but it just can't get all of them in there. Okay? But it can, on individual one-by-one basis, come to the absolute truth on this or that matter. So let me give you an illustration. David Hume was a philosopher who said and talked as though, who spoke in such a way that the things that we know, the sentences that we know, the thoughts of the mind, can be discretely related to each. You see it occur in his writings. David Hume was atomistic. The billiard ball understanding of reality and the billiard ball understanding of knowledge and truth. Individual truths relate to each other like billiard balls, just like individual realities do. On the other hand, Hegel, who took a more monistic approach to reality and a correspondence theory of truth, was not fascinated by the billiard ball analogy as a way of explaining things. Hegel liked the idea of a tree that buds, and you go from the bud to the flower in a gradual development. All of reality is related to everything else. And what happens in human thinking and in the real world is that things tend to evolve. They are related to each other and they work their way out like a biological entity, such as the tree blossoming. Or if you will, you could think of it in terms of a tadpole becoming a frog. At some point, we might like to say that this entity is a tadpole, and then we're embarrassed because a little later it doesn't look like a tadpole anymore, it's a frog. And tadpoles and frogs don't look a whole lot alike, and so it seems embarrassing. But Hegel said that our knowledge is like that. Anytime we try to isolate something as true right here and now, we end up having nothing but approximation of the truth. We're speaking of tadpoles, when in fact what we see is a tadpole on its way to becoming a frog. Everything is in a more evolving, biologically unfolding pattern of explanation for Hegel. Whereas for Hume, everything's in a mechanical, discrete, billiard ball kind of explanation. Now, what happens when the followers of Hegel and the followers of Hume argue with each other? What happens when those who take a monistic approach to reality, those who are oriented toward the stability, enduring aspects of reality, when those people argue with those that are oriented toward the discrete, changing, atomistic aspects of reality? What happens when somebody who holds to a correspondence theory of truth starts arguing with someone who holds to a coherence theory of truth? Are they very satisfied with their argument? They come to resolution very easily? No, they're like ship's pattern. And so, if you're a philosopher that is on this side of the board, the monistic coherence side of things, and you hear a philosopher that's coming from the other school of thought, the atomistic correspondence understanding of things, and you don't like what he says, you're going to start arguing with him and arguing on the basis of your theory of truth, aren't you? Obviously, you're not going to argue on the basis of his theory of truth, which you think is wrong and fundamentally misguided. You're going to say, you're always oversimplifying things. You're trying to break things down into discrete entities, real clear truths, isolated realities, isolated sentences that are true. And that isn't the way the world is. The world is a give and take place. It's a flexible place. Everything's in tension. Everything's growing. Everything is developing. You need to catch on to the unity of things and stop stressing this discreteness of things. And if you're on that side of the board, where you hold to the atomist correspondence approach to reality and truth, you're going to listen to this guy and say, you're nuts. That isn't the way reality is. And I'm not impressed with your argument at all. Because if you want to convince me of something, you're going to take a correspondence approach to truth, and you're going to start recognizing the discreteness and clarity and independent realities that are out there in this world. And so I'd like to give you an argument for why those things are the way they are. And then that person starts showing the correspondence between ideas and experience, shows the mechanical relationship of discrete entities and how you can do science and so forth. Now, is the person over here back now on side one, the Hegel side of the board, is he going to be slain by that kind of argument and say, okay, I give up, I guess you're right? He's going to say, what are you talking about? You're always oversimplifying. You're always trying to break things down into these discrete entities and categories and so forth. That isn't how you get at truth. Now, do I have to do the round to show you how Hegel goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? Because the problem here is not that one school of thought has done its homework and the other hasn't. The problem is that they don't even agree over what kind of homework we should be doing. Because they don't agree about the nature of reality or how we know what we know. And as long as their disagreements are that fundamental, they aren't even going to be able to argue meaningfully with each other. They will not be able to resolve their disputes. That's why the history of philosophy is such a mess. You have the followers of Plato and the followers of Aristotle, and they both had what seemed to be very brilliant things to say, things that in one way or another accounted for parts of reality that are to be taken account of by us. Plato knew that the object of knowledge had to be something stable and unchanging. Plato knew that to know something meant to know the formula for it. He's the father of science in the way that we pursue it today. He knew that you had to see through to the form or the basic or general idea of something and not just stress the particularity of things. But then he had to ask, well, where are these forms? Where are these formulas? Where are these general ideas of things, like ideas of the general concept of a cat, or of a tree, or of a river, or of a human being? And Plato said, I know that I don't run into that in my experience. I never run into catness. I may run over a cat every now and then, a particular cat, but I never run over catness. And I run into people, individual people, but I never run into human nature, the general idea of human nature. And so Plato posited a world beyond the world of experience, a realm of reality beyond our day-to-day experience, where you don't have Huey, Dewey, and Louie, you find rather duckness. You find the form of the duck, the idea or the formula for a duck. But in this world, we don't find duckness, we find Huey, Dewey, and Louie out on the pond, whatever. Now, Aristotle comes along and he says, well, this is all very interesting, Plato, but what earthly good is it? Because you see, the most important thing to me is to be able to understand motion and change in this world. And you tell me about these ideas or forms in a realm beyond this world, but they have no relationship to day-to-day experience. They can't explain why things change. Have you ever noticed how tadpoles become frogs and acorns become oak trees? That's what I want explained. And so for Aristotle, the form of something, its basic essence, is not in another world, but is here and now. It's part of the particular duck or particular acorn or oak tree that you're encountering. And he had to posit, he had to just take for granted that every particular reality has within itself a kind of motion, a kind of movement, a kind of dynamic, as it were, that moves it from potentiality to actuality. Everything has within it its principle of motion and change. And so Aristotle is a lot more concrete, Aristotle is a lot more scientific, Aristotle is a lot more particular, he's a lot more down to earth, and Aristotle accounts for things that are very interesting to scientists like motion. Or does it? Aristotle took for granted that there was within things this principle of movement or motion or change. You have the embryo that develops into a little baby, grows and grows and grows. You've all noticed that, of course. You've seen baby pictures of yourself. There's been major changes, and yet you consider yourself the same human being. Aristotle said there is a basic principle of motion within natural objects. Well, now we have to go back and say, yeah, Plato wasn't real helpful. I mean, he explains the form, the general concept of things, puts it in a world that's beyond my experience. Aristotle's very down to earth, deals with the particularities of experience, but he just arbitrarily tells me things change. He says, I'm just supposed to take it for granted that things do what they do, that acorns develop into oak trees, and tadpoles into frogs, and so forth and so on. And that doesn't seem like real good philosophy. That seems rather arbitrary. That seems almost to be begging the question, taking for granted what was supposed to be explained. Okay, let's see if we can bring some of this together. In the history of philosophy, we see that there are different orientations toward the basic nature of reality and basic orientations toward the question of truth and how we know what we know. We see that adherents of different schools of philosophical thought cannot meaningfully argue with each other because they don't share the same presuppositions. And we also see that philosophers tend to make two big mistakes that we should all try to avoid. The first, most obvious mistake made by philosophers is that they are arbitrary in what they say. They are arbitrary. They do not have a good reason for what they say, but they tend to hide that really well. They talk about entelechies and teleological matters, and they don't even reveal to you that they're taking for granted that everything is moving from potential to actuality. Everything is changing. They don't tell you why that really happens. On the other hand, philosophers can fall into self-contradiction. They can be inconsistent. In one part of their philosophy, they may stress one aspect of what we see on the board, monism or coherence, and yet in another part of their philosophy, they will stress correspondence or an atomistic and discrete view of reality. But again, that is not always real obvious. When we do an analysis of a school of philosophy, one of the things we have to do is look for these tensions. Okay, now you want to get this into your notes. What the Christian philosopher is called upon to do is to examine the different schools of philosophy or different individual philosophers to find the dialectical tensions that exist within their philosophy. To find the dialectical tensions. That is to say, those things within their school of thought that do not work with each other, do not go together, and to expose that tension to show the inadequacy of the worldview being proposed. Now, why is it that we are in a position as Christians to expose the tension within different schools of philosophy or within the philosophy of individual writers and teachers? Well, the one reason we are is because the Christian philosophy of life is one that doesn't fall into either the monistic or the atomistic camp, the correspondence or coherence camp of thinking. The Christian's approach to philosophy is able to take care of both aspects of reality, both aspects of knowing. And we know how to relate the two to each other because God has revealed himself and has revealed the basic nature of reality. Is reality most basically one, or is reality most basically discrete in many? Well, what is the most fundamental reality according to the Christian? Is it the world, or is it God the Creator? God the Creator. Now, is God the Creator characterized by oneness or by manyness? By both, because we hold to a Trinitarian conception of God's nature. Consequently, we believe that the oneness of God, the basic reality, and the manyness of God, the basic reality, are equally ultimate. And so we don't choose between these two orientations. We try to take them both into account by seeing the world as God sees the world. We go to God's revelation and we thank God after him as we go out to the world and understand the nature of reality and how we know. You see, so the Christian doesn't choose between these things, and not choosing between them, we don't end up with the internal tensions that non-Christian philosophies often do. Let me give another illustration of this for you. There are certain philosophies that look at the world and say, the world is capable of rational description. Everything that is real can be described. Everything that is real can be ultimately known. Everything is knowable. Well, the problem with that approach, of course, if you're a non-Christian, is you have to say, well, if it's knowable, who knows it? If everything that is knowable, who is the one that knows that everything? And see, even if you took all the computers we have in the world and hooked up all the discrete things that individuals know that they can pump into the computer, we still wouldn't have everything. And so sooner or later it becomes evident that whatever scheme for reality or knowledge that is proposed by the unbeliever doesn't account for everything. Whatever you offer as your basic nature of reality doesn't fit everything. So what do you do then if you're an unbeliever? If you're a non-Christian, you've got a rational scheme to understand the world and human knowledge, and it doesn't take account of everything, then you're either going to say, well, what my philosophy doesn't take account of isn't true and real. Because if it doesn't fit in the suitcase, I cut it off, and then we just go ahead. Or you're going to say, everything in this world is knowable, but there's another principle that has to be brought in, and that's that no one ever ultimately knows for sure. And that is what we call the irrational tendency in philosophy. The irrational tendency or orientation of philosophy has to admit that the human mind is limited, and it cannot therefore be the ultimate authority, because the human mind doesn't take everything into account. And that seems to be very helpful, because it's humble, it's practical. You see, it admits there are shortcomings. No one can ever know for sure. But then, of course, if no one can ever know for sure, then the non-Christian irrationalist is never going to have a philosophy, because no one can ever know for sure. And so here he is, bouncing back and forth between confidence that someone can know about reality, everything that is real and describable in language, and yet no one really knows for sure. And so you have this kind of tension. What do we call that? Dialectical tension within your philosophy. And every non-Christian has that dialectical tension. Does the Christian have that tension? Is the Christian a rationalist in his approach to reality or an irrationalist in his approach to reality? Well, the Christian agrees that the human mind is limited. In that sense, the Christian holds to an irrational approach to knowledge. It says the human mind cannot be the ultimate authority. It is limited. It is fallible. On the other hand, the Christian holds to a rationalist approach because he says God's mind knows everything. And because God's mind knows everything and created everything, God can reveal to my limited mind what I need to know about reality, so I can be sure about my philosophy and the ultimate authority in my philosophy. Every philosophy must grant that the human mind has its rational powers, but also that it has its rational limits. But if you don't have God's Word as the foundation of your philosophy, you don't know where to draw the line. You don't know how to begin and end your thinking. And so you get stuck in this rational-irrational tension going back and forth, whereas for the Christian, we bow to the authority of God. The beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord. And based on God's revelation, we then have authority to go out and understand the world. We can be rational, even though we may start with a faith commitment to God Himself, whose mind is beyond our mind and is really incomprehensible. If you don't submit to God's Word at the beginning of your philosophy, you're going to be led into this tension between monism and atomism, between coherence, correspondence, rationalism, irrationalism. I think we have time for one more illustration of what I'm talking about here. And now, if you have been having trouble following this, and I know it's getting late, and these are abstract matters, you should be able to follow this easier. Let's talk about political theorizing for a moment. In political theory, there are those schools of thought that tend toward the oneness of society, that tend toward a law and order approach to society, that emphasize the state and its authority over against the citizens who are individual. There are those political philosophies that maximize unity and minimize individual freedom. Right? And then there are those philosophies of politics that go the opposite direction and say the important thing is that every individual can do whatever he or she wants, maximizes the freedom of the individual, and ends up minimizing then the law and order or if you will, the unity of the society. Now, if you're an unbelieving philosopher, which of these are you going to follow? You're going to maximize unity, law and order. You're going to maximize freedom and individuality. Well, of course, if you're going to maximize freedom and individuality, you're going to end up in what? Anarchy, exactly. Chaos. Every man's a law to himself. You can't even tell people what side of the street to drive on because they're free and they'll be creative and do whatever they want. Well, that's what you do in Brooklyn. That's right. No, wait. Yeah, I forgot where it was. Anyway, on the other hand, if you say, no, what we need is unity and stability, law and order, you're going to tend toward tyranny. When the state starts making decisions for every individual and butting into areas of life it has no business butting into. Now what happens? Let's follow this out a little bit more. If you emphasize the freedom side of that tension, if you push individual activity and freedom and it moves toward anarchy, human beings can't live with anarchy. The society can't survive with that kind of chaos. And what comes in then to take care of the anarchy? A very strong state, exactly. So you push toward freedom, individuality, the manyness and discreteness of the individual members of society, and you end up getting the very opposite as the correcting force. But now, what if you emphasize law and order? What if you like the state's authority and it moves toward tyranny, and the state butting into all these areas it shouldn't butt into? Then eventually, the people in the society can't stand having such a bully, such a brutal beast ruling over it, and they rebel against that. And so what you end up with is anarchy and revolution. And so you see the inherent tension in non-Christian political philosophy, and it cannot be escaped. What's the Christian's answer? Christian's answer is because God is one and many, there is an equal order and freedom. And we can approximate that, because we are sinful, it's only an approximation. But we can approximate in society the proper balance between order and freedom by following God's revelation for the state. The state knows its limits given by God, but the state also has its authority given by God. And within the biblical account of the state, therefore, you have not only law and order, but you have individual freedom and creativity for the citizens. So, once again, an illustration of how the Christian approach to philosophy avoids the dialectical tensions within non-Christian approaches to philosophy. And those dialectical tensions, whether they be in metaphysics, or epistemology, or ethics, political ethics, arise because unbelievers try to be a law to themselves and thereafter cannot account for aspects of reality, all of the aspects of knowing, all of the aspects of ethics, and they have to then idolize or emphasize one or the other. And that's what gets them into difficulty, gets them into trouble. Okay, let's look at ancient philosophy, modern philosophy, and then 20th century philosophy before we get done this evening. Having given you some of the problems of philosophy and some of the orientations and tendencies in philosophy and how the Christian deals with them, I'd like to now just do kind of a quick historical sketch, and then before I lose my audience completely, let you ask me some questions and we go home. If we go back to the beginnings of ancient Greek philosophy, we see a number of schools of thought that I'd like to summarize for you dealing with central questions. One question that was raised by ancient Greek philosophers is the basic nature of reality. What is the stuff out of which everything that is real arises? And some schools of thought held that that stuff was something physical, something like water or air, or a combination thereof of air and water and fire and so forth. So you have naturalistic philosophy telling us that we have to look for some one or perhaps combination of individual elements that make up everything that is real. Now, in terms of what I have on the board, what kind of philosophy would that be then? Trick question, Professor. If someone says everything is air, then it's monistic. If someone says everything is made up of 4 different kinds of elements, like earth, air, fire, and water, then they're dark side, right? And so here's where things start getting kind of dicey in the history of philosophy. You realize that these orientations represent non-Christian overemphases and dialectical tension, but these 2 non-Christian points of view, they are both contrary to the Christian approach to life, but they have their own internal disagreements as well. And so, should we be atomistic or should we be monistic? Comes up all over again. But even if you are monistic, there's going to be arguments as to what is the basic reality. Is it water? Is the basic reality air? Or what have you? As a matter of fact, other schools of thought don't see the fundamental reality as physical or as stuff at all, but they see the fundamental reality as being something conceptual. Somebody like Anaximander said that no one particular thing you choose is going to fit for every kind of reality you have to describe. And so therefore there must be an indescribable something from which the world came. There must be a kind of homogeneous soup from which every particular thing eventually spun out in an evolutionary way. Does that surprise you? The theory of evolution goes way back to ancient Greek philosophy. What you have is a one, this kind of soupy stuff, the homogeneous apeiron, and it became a many. It became giraffes and tigers and sailing ships. Now, what has to be accounted for? If this one became a many, well, what's the source of change and motion? And so then in ancient Greek philosophy, you have different approaches to motion. You have saying motion must not be real. It must be just an illusion. And he has his disciple Zeno, not Zorro, Zeno, who gives these interesting dialectical puzzles to show that motion is impossible. Zeno said if you shoot an arrow from point A to point B, before it can get all the way to point B, it has to go halfway. And before it can go halfway, it has to go half of halfway. And then half of half of half of halfway. And then half of half of half of half of halfway. And so forth and so on. And that halving of the distance can go on to infinity. And since the arrow is finite and the amount of time we're talking about is finite, but the distance is infinite, it can't ever have happened. Yeah, that's when a lot of people check out of class and say, yeah, right. But there are certain paradoxes or problems with the idea that things change. Why do we consider it the same thing even after it's gone through the metamorphosis and so forth? There are problems with that. But then on the other hand, Heraclitus went the other way from Parmenides and said, everything is changing. It's not that there's no motion, it's that there's nothing but motion. And then he had to account for what? Well, why does it appear that there are stabilities or realities that are unchanging? So unbelieving philosophy in the ancient world had to account for what is the basic stuff of reality.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell notification.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute. Duplication, sharing, and distribution is encouraged. For more information about the life and ministry of Dr. Greg L. Bahnsen, visit our website, bahnseninstitute.com, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.